Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next session of the Baselight 6 learning program. Today, I have a lot of things to show about the HSE scales and curves in the new curve grade, and therefore I would say I jump directly into my examples that I have prepared for you. Okay, let's play with the HSE curves today. HSE stands for hue, saturation, and exposure, which are the three scales that these curves are working in. This is another new perceptual color model that has been developed for Baselight version 6 and is optimized for scene-referred images. On the top left, here we can see 5 preset curves, and they are processed from left to right through curve grade. So first, this saturation versus hue curve is processed until the hue versus hue, and then the mRGBY curves are processed inside curve grade. Both axes of these curves can be customized here in these drop-down menus on the bottom. So these are just presets, and you can change them in whatever way you want. To understand what each curve is doing, always remember, first we select the scale that we want to modify. So in this curve, we want to modify the saturation, which is on the y-axis. And then after the versus, we select on which scale we want to base this modification. So here we can modify the saturation based on the hues. So let's say if we wanted to desaturate the green tones, I can put a point here and a few other ones here, and then I can pull down the saturation here of the green tones. Of course, you can also use the picking mode. So if we select here, for example, select center, we can then also pick on the green apple, and it adds the center point here on the green and 2 other points to protect the rest of the hue range. But what I personally prefer is working with the highlight pick and keeping the pick mode disabled. Then we can pick into various ranges of the image and identify where do these pixels live in the current x-axis scale. Okay, so let's do something realistic on the image. So when I look at all the fruit and vegetables here on the table, I would say maybe I would like to increase the saturation here of the grapes a bit. So to me, they feel a bit desaturated compared to all the other fruits and vegetables here on the table. So we can see their hue range lives roughly in that area here. And so I will add a point here and then another point very close to them. So it's a quite narrow range. And then I can pull up my saturation control for this area. So let's see how it looks before, after. Yeah, and I'm zooming in a bit to make it more obvious. And we can see, yeah, it adds a nice boost of saturation on these grapes. Notice how the color of the y-axis changes based on the currently selected point on the curve. Let's move on to the next shot. A dominant color in this frame is the red jacket, which is this blob here on my chromaticity diagram. So what if I want to have a really strong red color here? So what I want to do is I want to place it in the corner of the Rec 709 color gamut, so to have an almost maximum Rec 709 red for that jacket here. So we need to move that blob here into that corner because currently I'm overlaying my mastering color space, which is Rec 709 in my chromaticity plot. Of course, I'm working as always in a scene referred color space with a display rendering transform. So here I would start with first moving the hue of the red here closer to the corner. So I go into the hue versus hue curve. If I'm picking the jacket, we can clearly see there's also that mountain here on our hue histogram. This is where the jacket is living. And typically I want to put my protection points in the valleys of the histogram, so where fewer colors are living. And here on the right side, we can see we can put the second point all the way here to the right, because usually the longer the transition is, the smoother our correction will be. And so here, because we have no colors in the image with these hues, we can use that as a safety range. So now I can move the point on the hue scale, and we can see I can move it now closer to the corner and changing the hue here. And then additionally, I will use the saturation versus hue curve. So that means now I want to change the saturation based on the hue. So I'm putting another point here using pretty similar outside points, and now pushing out the saturation here now closer to the Rec 709 boundary. And we should see that we now increased definitely the vibrance of that red jacket. Maybe now it looks quite saturated and intense. So we could additionally use another curve. So now I want to darken it based on the hue. So to darken, we have two options available. So we have here the gain versus hue curve. And as another option, we have the exposure versus hue curve. Gain moves the highlights the most, and when we're darkening, it compresses all the colors towards black. So it reduces the contrast while darkening, and when we are brightening, it increases the contrast. Exposure on the other side is working more like an offset. So when we're darkening, we can run into the problem of pushing values below 0, and then we will have super crushed blacks. I can maybe show that as an example here. So if I'm darkening the jacket a lot, we can see it can get quite black here in certain areas. Now I reset that curve, switch it back to gain. If we do a similar operation with the gain, we can see that it's not pushing the blacks below 0. So for darkening, I would generally recommend using more the gain and using the exposure more for brightening pixels in the image. Because when we are brightening, then exposure is not expanding the contrast. So usually our goal should be to not increase the contrast of the pixels, but more to reduce the contrast. That will give us more smooth and more robust results. So that level is maybe a little bit too dark for the jacket. So let's settle with something like that. And we hopefully have a nice result now on the image that we're happy with. So to recap, gain is like a video grade, gain, and exposure is like exposure in film grade. We renamed both of these scales to make it easier to understand what is actually going on under the hood. On the next shot, I want to increase the color of the sky here. So first, what I would try is saturation versus hue. Once again, here we can see there's a lot of blue pixels in the image. I guess we would not need to pick here on the sky, but yeah, we can see it here. So this is the main range here of the blue hues. And probably I will add some protection points here and here. So we have a wide range there. And now I can try to push it up. And we can see we get a nice saturation increase here on the sky. And images like this can be difficult because of the smooth transition here and the blurry transition of the foreground to the background. And watch how Curve Grade treats that smoothly. And additionally, we might also want to change slightly the hue of the sky. Then we can go into the hue versus hue curve and, for example, push the sky gently a little bit more towards cyan. So this is the before, after on that image. On the next shot, I want to build a custom curve. So here I want to boost up the saturation of the lower saturated colors, but we also have some quite highly saturated colors already in the image. So here these dark orange and red tones, for example. So let's first go to a saturation-based curve. In this case, gain versus saturation. And what I want to do is I want to do saturation versus saturation on that shot. So I want to keep the highly saturated colors where they are. So I put another point here. And if we do a quick pick, we can see that, yeah, these are probably these colors here that are living on the far end of the saturation scale. And I want to increase the saturation here more on the lower saturated values. But also I want to keep my zero saturation range at the same point. So I'm also adding a point here that I don't want to move. And so now I can move up that part of the curve. And what we should see is that we get a nice saturation for the lower saturated colors without overshooting these ones here. So this is before, this is after. Maybe I'm moving this one here even a little bit closer. And before, after. Yeah, and we can see that here the outside of the gamut stays more or less untouched, and we're pushing out more the inside lower saturated colors. Also notice how well distributed a shot like this is in our new saturation scale. In our baselight 5.3 legacy curves, which were based on 709 HSE math, the whole saturation scale of that image would live here in the first 5 to maximum 10% in a wide gamut space. So working with that kind of curve is almost impossible. Even when you zoom into the curve, it's very fiddly. So that's a huge improvement here that we have with that saturation scale. Instead of using that relative saturation versus saturation curve, you can also use the absolute saturation versus saturation curve. So then the unity curve is that diagonal going from 0 to 1. So here we would work in a similar way. First, we would protect our highly saturated colors, maybe with a point here. I add another point here at 0. And then we put a point here somewhere on the lower end and raise that one up, which should also give us a similar response to the relative curve. So this really depends on your personal preference. If you want to build, for example, a smooth saturation roll-off for super saturated colors, then personally I prefer this absolute curve. But for a small tweak, like I showed here before, I prefer the relative curve. Let's move on to the next shot, and let's do a custom look on this shot that we already know. What is currently quite popular among colorists is darkening highly saturated colors in images. And there's a special technique in Curve Grade available that I want to share with you because it gives a lot of control to the process. So in that case, we want to lower the gain based on saturation. So we want to say low saturated colors should stay as bright as they are, and highly saturated colors we want to darken in the image. I don't want to pull that all the way down to 0 because we don't want to end up with black pixels for certain colors, but let's say we pull it down to around 0.4 or 0.5. So this is now currently quite strong, as you can see on the image. But also witness how clean that tool works. So if I zoom in and step a few frames, we can see that it's not starting to introduce noise easily. But now I would say on that specific shot here, the reds are darkened too much. I really like the effect on the greens and the blues, but I would say the yellows are darkened a lot, and also the reds are darkened a lot. And wouldn't it be great if we could limit the effect of that curve here based on the hues in the image? And by now you probably already know that when I ask this kind of suggestive question, that there is a solution available. And indeed there is. And this is a really cool trick inside Curve Grade, which are the modulation curves. So we have that small tick box here at the bottom. So now let's recap. We have a curve that modifies our gain, so basically the brightness of pixels based on the saturation. So we have this curve. So low saturated pixels stay at their original brightness, and highly saturated pixels are darkened by a certain amount here depending on our curve. So now we have this curve as our main curve. And now I switch over into the modulation curve. What I have available are the two remaining scales, hue and exposure, because remember, the first curve is based on saturation. So now I can say with the modulation curve, I can modulate the amount of my main curve. So where the modulation curve is 1, the main curve has full effect, and where the modulation curve is 0, the main curve has 0 effect. So, okay, let's do something real here. So what I said is I want to lower the amount on the reds and also on the yellows, but I really like the effect on the greens and on the blues. So now I put my main points here, and so now let's pull down the modulation curve on the reds and witness how we are reducing the effect of the main curve, the darkening effect on just on the red tones. And we can also do something here on the yellows. I want to really have bright yellows on that shot. So let's build maybe something like that. And so here you can really build a custom modulation for your main curve. So we can really build a custom look for our specific shot. So let's see what our curve does in total. Yeah, so now we have a nice darkening effect here, and we can even go into the previous layer, maybe push up a little bit of the saturation upstream, and so we can then push these colors even harder into our darkening curve. This one here, before, after. So the modulation curves make each curve twice as powerful because you can base each curve on 2 of the scales. You might ask yourself now, okay, so should I use curve grade for look development? And my answer would be, I would rather suggest Chromogen. So we should consider the scope of each tool. So Chromogen really has the scope to create looks that can work with a whole movie or even several movies. So it has a really broad scale. And curve grade has a more narrow scale. So typically we use curve grade to work on a shot-by-shot basis, but we can also, with this kind of very smooth curves, we can also build custom looks for a series of shots that we, for example, currently see in our viewer. So generally, I would say the looks that we build in curve grade are really more tailored for the specific shot that we currently see. But if you have a small series of shots, so if you have, for example, 10 or 20 shots that you need a custom, very precise tailored look for, then go for it and try to do it with curve grade. So I suggest to build the look for the whole movie with Chromogen. And when you run into issues with a specific scene, then try and use curve grade to take it from there, for example. On the next shot, I already built such a curve here with gain versus saturation. And here I turned off the auto handles, being able to pull down the low saturated colors even more. So maybe let's take that point here and move it even a little bit lower so that we're really darkening the saturated colors a lot. I think I also already built like a custom modulation curve here for that shot based on the hues to give a custom darkening effect for each hue in the image. And what I want to build on top of that is another saturation versus saturation curve. So in that case, I want to make my custom look really robust against high saturated values coming into it. I mean, I need to say that it's not breaking easily. I can really push up the saturation here upstream tremendously, and you can see that the curves are not breaking and causing any weird artifacts. But what I want to do is I want to basically roll off the super highly saturated colors. So maybe I put a point somewhere here. I put one point here at the end of the scale. And if I'm now pulling that one here down, I can create that smooth roll off. And also notice by using the auto handles, it's slightly raising also the saturation here on the mid-saturated values, which is nice in my example. And so let's move that point here really far out on the saturation scale. And like that, we're also getting a nice effect. Yes, it's still darkening. And now if we push up the saturation here upstream, we can see that now it's even more robust and not going into these oversaturated areas. I want to quickly disable my mastering color space in the scene settings. so that we can see what is going on here on the chromaticity diagram. So now let's see, when I push up the saturation, see how that saturation here is going again into that soft clip through the curve grade. So this is now what is introduced by that smooth saturation roll off here. So you can see that. So that's also nice to know about. But you should always have the mastering operation on set white and clip to ensure that you're not rendering out of gamut colors into your deliverables. Okay, so let's reduce that saturation amount here a little bit. It's quite oversaturated to a more modest amount like that. Yeah, looking better. And let's zoom in to the chromaticity diagram. Let's have a look at the next shot. So here what I can see is, or what is to me the most disturbing thing on first sight, is that clipping here of the sensor in the highlights. So we can see here in the center we're having no color saturation. So here all color channels are clipping. We can see here in the yellow areas, this is where the red channel on the sensor already clipped. So this is something that we cannot avoid on a shot like that, even with modern cameras. And we can also see that unnatural shape here of these values in the chromaticity diagram. So that artificial looking color shift here is introduced, or is represented by that artificial shape here also in the chromaticity diagram. So what I want to do is I want to create a smooth curve here that looks more natural, of course, in the image, but let's also watch the chromaticity diagram at the same time. And what do we need for that? We need a hue versus hue curve. So let's see where we are here. Okay, so these values here are that small blob here at the bottom, and probably these values here are this range here basically. So what I'm trying is I'm putting a point here. I mean, here on the right side, we can see there we have a huge range available just to use as a roll off. And so now I'm putting a point here and starting to move it around to see how we can find a more smoother shape here for our hues. So maybe something like this, I would say. So now we can see we have a smoother shape here on the chromaticity diagram. And also what is more important is that it also looks nicer on the image here. So we're avoiding that unnatural sudden hue shift. Okay, what else can we do on that image? So I want to flip back quickly into my master curve that we discussed in detail in the last session, and maybe let's boost up a little bit the gamma on such a backlit shot here. That gives a nicer mood to the image. And if we go to the Y curve, we can also see that the clipped sun here is sitting a little bit low, and on some displays that also can look a little bit strange because the energy basically coming from the sun is suddenly clipped and it's not having the intensity it should have because of the sensor clipping. So I can put a point here and maybe push up my brightest highlights here on the curve to give the sun a little bit more natural intensity. So this is now already before after, looking better. And there's another thing that I want to do on that shot here. So now with the lower brightness in the midtones, we're losing a bit the jacket of the climber. So it would be great if we could raise up that jacket here in brightness a bit. And if you remember what I said before, for raising the brightness, using the exposure scale is a good idea. So we're doing exposure versus hue. So let's see where our jacket is living. Okay, here, as we expected, it's that small bump here in the reds. I put a protection here maybe on the oranges and here somewhere in the valley of the magentas. So typically I try to put my points either in the deep into the valleys or on the peaks of the histogram. And I think that works better putting them manually based on that highlight pick than using the pick mode. But that's just my personal preference. So now we can raise up the brightness or the exposure of the jacket. Yeah, not too bad. But what we can see is, oh yeah, so working good on the jacket, but it's also raising some other areas here of the shot that we maybe don't want to target our correction onto. What can we do? Modulation curve for the rescue. So let's try an exposure modulation curve and let's see where our jacket is living on our exposure curve. It's living here in the deepest shadows. And these areas here, oh, they are much brighter. So what does that mean? So these areas we don't want to affect. So here the curve should be 0, and these areas we want to affect. So here the curve should be 1. So let's do something like this. I put a point here and another point here, and now I'm just dragging the curve all the way down here to 0. So now we're focusing our main curve, which makes reds brighter, just on the dark reds. So now we're only raising dark reds, and look what we got, a really nice effect on the jacket of the climber. Maybe I reduce it a little bit, and of course I can also zoom in so that you can examine it on some moving frames, that the correction is clean, not introducing any noise, etc. Okay, let's move on. On this shot, I want to unify the flesh tones of these two actors. So here we have a lot of variation, going from a little bit greenish tones to magenta-ish skin tones. So I want to push them a little bit closer together. So how do we do that? With curve grade, we need the hue versus hue curve. And now let's first examine where we are living. Okay, so this is this range here. This is actually looking quite similar. And to perform a hue unification, we need to first put a point at the hue that we want to compress towards to. So we need to find one of the hues where we think this one is good. So maybe here, let's take one here on the arm, maybe narrow one. Yeah, so let's use this one. And then what we want to do is we want to then raise or lower the curve on the one side and then do the opposite on the other side of that point. So basically that point here, the hue stays where it is. So the hue curve stays at 0. And we want to then have it either go upwards like this or downwards like this for a compression. And so now let's first put our protection points here around also, maybe somewhere here, and another one, maybe at the end of that thing. And so now I need to check out which way on which side. So here on the left side, I'm now basically raising the curve, moving the magenta tones away from magenta more towards yellow-red. And that means on the right side, I need to lower the curve. So this is how a hue unification should look like on a hue versus hue curve. This is the center point, and on these two sides, we're now basically pushing the hues all to the same area here in the middle. So what does it do on our image? Definitely we can also witness that here on the chromaticity plot, compressing the hues, but our lips are now affected more than I would like to see an effect on them. So I would really prefer to have them more in that magenta-ish or more reddish skin tone. So what do? We do a modulation curve. And in this case, we modulate based on the saturation. So we say for low saturated colors, we want to have the full effect. But for the more highly saturated colors, like our lips, I'm now pulling down the curve, maybe to something like this. And then I'm always orienting myself here on the histogram of the current shot. So I see that these are the most saturated colors in the current frame. So it does not make sense to pull it down like that, because here we would only have a minimal modulation effect. So probably I need to pull it somewhere here in that range. So what is the net result of our tweak now? I hope you can still see it. It does that subtle compression of the skin tones. We can also see that here on the chromaticity diagram, but the lips are not affected that much. And of course we could tweak that. If we want more effect on the lips and on the skin in general, we can pull that one here out. Then we have a little bit more collateral effect, but also more compression on the skin, etc. Let's move on and do a little bit more surreal curve tweak on this shot here. So here I want to work on the color of the sky. So I want to add a little bit of a gradient to the sky. And the end result will look a little bit surreal, but I hope it's a good example for you to understand how to work with the modulation curve in certain ranges even better. So I guess it's very obvious where our hues are living on that sky, but just to prove it, yeah, so these are the blue colors here. So I'm definitely putting 1 point here on my blue mountain in my histogram, and then I'm adding some points here. So here on the right side of the blue mountain, we really have a wide range to put our protection point. We're not harming anything here. And so now I can move that sky here, for example, towards like a purple color. But what I want to do is I want to modulate now that color based on the brightness of the sky. So let's maybe pull it down for a moment. So we can see here that it's brighter at the bottom and darker at the top. And so I only want to introduce that shift here gradually with the brightness. And of course, we're doing that again with the modulation curves. And we're using an exposure modulation here. And so now the picking becomes more important, because now I'm picking again here in the sky to see the range that the sky is covering in the exposure. So we can see, okay, so here's the darkest part of the sky. So there I don't want an effect. And that's also then excluding here the shadow areas here on the mountains. And let's pick again on the sky. And this is my brightest area of the sky. So here I want to have the full effect. So I really want to have the transition of hue across this range here. So the only thing I need to do is pull that side of the curve down to 0 and leave the other one at 1. So now we can see we nicely introduce that shift of color here on the sky. And maybe now we want to increase the effect even more. I can go to also extended mode here on my curves, but then as usual, be more careful because it's easier to break the image. And we can then introduce an even stronger modulation here across the color of the sky. If we examine closely now the effect of that thing here on the sky, maybe you can see that we have a little bit of noise here around the clouds, but also this is quite a challenging image here to do such an operation with that smooth transition of the clouds here into the sky. So this is before, this is after. But always remember, whatever you do in baselight, you always have the texture blend mode for the rescue. So I can then, for example, add a bit of texture blend to make the effect of the curve very smooth. And so now we're very safe here if we wanted to do such a tweak on that shot here. On the next shot, I have another imaginary node that we have to implement on the image. We are not happy with the darkness of the shadows on that wall here. So we would like to make that shadow a little bit less dark. So first let's leave extended mode and go into gain versus hue. So let's first do our pick to examine what is going on. Okay, so this is the same hue, but I guess, yeah, it's definitely this mountain here. And so let's put our protection points here somewhere there. And now let's raise the gain. Yeah, working good. But of course, it's now also brightening the non-shadow parts of the building. And what do we need to do? You can probably already guess it. Modulation curve, exposure. Let's pick where our shadows are living. Shadows are here, highlights are there. So that means we need to build a transition from here having, for example, full effect, and here having none of the effect. So let's see how that goes. Let's try to build a nice and smooth transition here. And the effect of our curve is now, okay, yeah. So now we're only brightening the shadows. Of course, that looks a little bit artificial, and I would personally not do that tweak on the image if I would not be asked to, but I'm putting together these examples to show you different ways of thinking about using our new tools. And like that, I think I can definitely live with the result of the curve. You might now wonder, why did I use the gain and not the exposure to brighten pixels? And that's a good question from your side, because before I said that for brightening, I suggest exposure instead of gain. But during the preparation of these examples, I noticed that when I used the exposure, the contrast here got too flat, basically, and then it was looking even more artificial. So there are always exceptions. In the end, use what works best on the specific shot. On the next shot, we want to perform some nuanced tweaks of a face. And so the first thing that I notice are some slightly greenish tones here in the flesh tones that I want to remove. And I will try curve grade for that. So I go into my hue versus hue curve. Let's examine where our skin colors are living here. It's obvious that it's the big mountain here around orange. And I would say the greenish colors are here more the right flank of that mountain. But I will try to do a quite wide curve here from my protection area so that I have a very smooth curve. What I also see is that the green is a little bit more dominant in the shadows than in the highlights. So what we can do on top of that is, so let's first do a quite strong correction in our main curve and then add another level of modulation here via exposure. So let's say, in the shadows we have full effect, and in the highlights we have less of an effect, something like this. And so now hopefully you can see how we can get rid of these greenish tones here in our face. And let's do another tweak on that face. So let's say we want to make the face appear a little bit softer. So we want to basically make the dark parts of the skin slightly brighter with a gentle tweak here. So what I will do is not gain versus hue, but in this case again, exposure versus hue. So and I will put similar points here. And now let's raise the exposure of that face. And because I know that it will add some modulation on top, I'm doing a little bit stronger correction first. So that's nice. So what I see in the shadows is looking good, but of course it's now too bright in the highlights. But this is my idea. I want to target my correction not only on the skin tones, but only on the dark skin tones. So again, we do a modulation based on exposure. So here we want to have full effect, or let's do some picking. See our dark skin tones. Okay, they're living here and the bright ones are here. So let's say we want to do a very smooth curve. Maybe move that one a little bit closer. Like so. And so now we say the darker the pixels are, the more we want to brighten them, which is exactly what I want to do here. So now we're only making the dark pixels in the face brighter. And let's relax that correction a little bit to not overcook the face. So this is before, this is after. And so what if you want to focus the correction with all three scales? So if you say one modulation curve is not enough, so you want to modulate it based on exposure and on top of that based on saturation, because if we switch here over to saturation, we can see so now our exposure modulation curve is lost. So you can always only use one modulation curve. So let's undo that quickly. So then I suggest you just use our hue angle keyer, which uses the same HSE color model underneath. So now we already made a correction based on hue as the main curve, exposure as the secondary curve. So what we could do is you add a hue angle keyer to the layer, and then basically you can here then key in a correction based on the saturation as the last curve, for example. But let's not do that now. On the last shot, I want to show you one last trick. Here we have a simple task. We want to just improve the color of the sky here. I guess pretty straightforward. We use the saturation versus hue curve. I guess we can already see where the sky is living and put our protection points here. And so now if I crank up the saturation on that sky, we can see there's not much happening. And the reason for that is that the sky is almost white, so it does not have a strong hue here. And if something is almost white, then hue curves will not have that strong of an effect. But there's a way to fix that, and this is in the Customize menu. So here at the bottom, we have a hue safety parameter, which is valid for the current curve. And the default, and this is what I highly recommend, is leaving this on 1.0. So this protects you very nicely from breaking the image with any kind of weird artifacts. But for a case like this, where you really need to make the hue adjustments, let's say, more aggressive towards neutral tones, and you know what you're doing, so always think about it that you're now going off-piste, you can lower that hue safety amount. And so now I put it down to 0.25. And then we should see that, so now finally our curve has an effect. But always remember, when you reduce the hue safety, it's then easier to break the image and to introduce any kind of noise. These are the examples that I have prepared for today. I hope you could witness the precision of the new HSE curves and how hard it is to actually break images with them. So we really optimize them in that regard a lot, and how we can use them to do very bold corrections on images, but at the same time to also perform very nuanced and very subtle improvements in our grades. Thanks everyone for staying with me through that longer session. I hope it was worth it for you to see all of these examples. And also I was happy to see so many live attendees for this training session. And so yeah, if you have further questions, just put them as comments below the video and we will try to pick them up. So I say bye-bye and see you for the next one. Bye.